When you take a photo, you frame it with your camera. When you edit a photo, you get another chance to frame it by cropping. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to crop a photo in just 4 basic steps, using Photoshop's powerful crop features. The first step is to select the crop tool in the toolbar. Now there's a crop boundary around the image. This boundary will tell Photoshop what to keep and what to crop away when you complete the crop. Step 2 is to set the shape of your crop boundary. You can drag any corner of the boundary to change its width and height, and if you hold the Shift key as you do this, the boundary will retain its original proportions. Or you could just drag any corner of the boundary without holding the Shift key. You can also drag any edge of the boundary independently to get just the shape that you want. And if a photo needs straightening, you can move your cursor outside the boundary and then drag up or down and try to line up content like this horizon with the small grid that appears. An alternative way to set a crop boundary is to specify an aspect ratio. An aspect ratio isn't a particular size. Instead, it's the proportion of width to height. If you want to crop to an aspect ratio that's common for a photo, open this drop-down menu, go to the second section, and choose an aspect ratio, like 1:1 for a square. You can change the size of the square crop boundary by dragging any edge, but its 1:1 aspect ratio will stay the same. This is such a cute pet portrait, but it looks a bit dull, and it could use more brightness and contrast to take it from just okay to just right. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to use levels in Photoshop to adjust lighting in a photo. The first step is to add a levels adjustment layer so you can apply levels non-destructively. Go to the bottom of the Layers panel and click this round icon and choose Levels to create a new levels adjustment layer above the photo layer. Up in the Properties panel, there are now some controls for the selected levels adjustment layer, including this chart called a histogram. The levels histogram displays brightness levels that are in this photo. To the far left of the chart is an area for the darkest possible tones. The far right is for the brightest possible tones, and the middle is for gray tones in between. This white mound represents the actual tones in this photo now. It's made up of lots of vertical bars squeezed together. Each vertical bar in the mound represents one brightness level in the photo, and the height of a bar tells you the relative amount of that tone in the photo. This histogram confirms what we can see in the photo. If you look closely, you'll see that there are no vertical bars over on the far left of the histogram, which means there are no true blacks in the image. And there are just a few short bars on the right of the histogram, which means there are almost no whites in the image. Instead, most of the tones in the image are shades of gray. Ideally, we'd like darker blacks, brighter whites, and a wider range of tones in this photo. Have you ever been in a place with amazing colors, but the colors in your photos aren't as intense as you remember them being in real life? That's okay, because adding saturation in Photoshop can change subdued or washed out colors to the rich colors that you experienced at the scene. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to add life to your photos by boosting individual colors without having to make selections. It's all done with one hue saturation adjustment layer. Start at the bottom of the Layers panel and click the Create New Adjustment Layer button and choose Hue Saturation. You'll see a new hue saturation adjustment layer above the photo in the Layers panel, and controls for that adjustment layer are up here in the Properties panel. If you drag the saturation slider in the Properties panel to the right, all the colors in the image will be saturated to the same degree, which may not be the look you want. So let's set saturation back to 0, either by dragging it or double-clicking the saturation label. Instead, let's go to the menu toward the top of the Properties panel, which now reads Master, which means that changes you make affect the whole image, to Reds, which means that changes you make will affect only a range of red colors in the image. Beneath that, you've got a hue slider, which you can use to change the actual color, the saturation slider, which changes the intensity of color and which we'll be focusing on in this lesson, and the lightness slider, which is one way to change the brightness of a color. Let's drag the saturation slider to the right, and that increases the saturation or the intensity of all the red areas in the photo. Let's talk about the best ways to save your photographs in Photoshop. In this tutorial, we'll cover saving your photographs in the formats you'll use the most: PSD, JPEG, and PNG. The workflow we'll be using is to save a master version of the file in the PSD format, because that will retain all your edits. Then you'll make copies of that file in other formats, like JPEG or PNG, if and when you need them for a particular purpose. For example, here's a photo that was captured as a JPEG. I'll add a quick edit, a photo filter adjustment layer that will warm up the photo. Now let's save a master version of this file in a format that will preserve our adjustment layer. Go to the File menu and choose Save As. In the Save As dialog box, which looks a little different in Windows, go to the Format menu or the Save As Type menu and look for the format you want. Notice that this menu is showing only formats that will support this file with the features that we've added. And in this case, we added a layer, so these are formats that support layers. Of these, the one you'll use most is Photoshop. This will create a PSD file. PSD, or Photoshop Document, is the native Photoshop file format, and it retains all the edits special to Photoshop, like adjustment layers, masks, smart filters, and so on. So choose Photoshop, and then click Save, and click OK at the prompt. Now remember, we started with a JPEG. Now we've saved another version of this file as a PSD, and this will be your master version. So as you continue to work, sharpening is an important part of any photo editing workflow. In this tutorial, you'll learn a simple way to sharpen in Photoshop using the Unsharp Mask filter. And you'll learn how sharpening works. Did you know that sharpening does not fix a blurry photo, nor bring unfocused areas into focus? What sharpening does is accentuate details that are already in focus to draw users' attention to them. So let's jump in and sharpen a photo together. We'll start by zooming in to 100% view, since that's the only really accurate view for evaluating sharpness. A quick way to do that is to double-click the Zoom tool in the toolbar. Next, you'll wrap your photo in a package called a Smart Object that will keep your sharpening settings re-editable. So make sure that over in the Layers panel, the layer with the photo is selected. Then go up to the Filter menu and choose Convert for Smart Filters, and click OK. Next, go back to the Filter menu and choose Sharpen and Unsharp Mask. The Unsharp Mask dialog box pops up with some settings for this sharpening filter. The dialog box also has this small preview. So if your image is not at 100% view for any reason, you could view a small bit of the photo here in the dialog box at 100% as you work. And you can choose which part to view. Just move your cursor into the image and click on an area of detail that you want to sharpen, like the edge of this pearl, and it will appear here in the Unsharp Mask dialog box at 100% view by default. Before you apply the sharpening settings, it's a good idea to know how sharpening works. Photoshop looks for all the places inside the photo where there's a big drop-off from dark to light. Those are called edges. Photoshop makes the dark side of those edges darker and the bright side of the edges brighter, increasing contrast at those edges.